Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to this lecture where we are going to look at the ethical theory of utilitarianism from Jeremy Bentham, the English philosopher. But to set the scene a little bit for Bentham, to kind of give him an introduction, here are a couple images. There is a portrait of Jeremy Bentham that we will be looking at throughout the lecture. There's an image of Jeremy Bentham today. And there is an image of Jeremy Bentham today with Bentham's head down between his feet and a pair of glass eyes for his eyes, and of course that's a wax head on his shoulders. An interesting, unique introduction. Bentham, one of the things that Bentham requested is that upon his death, his body would be dissected and then stuffed in straw and dressed in his clothes and put on display at the University of College London, which obviously has been done, as is shown. Another request that Bentham had, too, was that when members of the college board would have their cabinet meetings, that he would be present. And this, too, was fulfilled, that when it comes time for a cabinet meeting, a board meeting, Bentham is wheeled into the cabinet room, and he's among those present. And in the cabinet minutes, the board minutes, he is listed as being among those present. Although when they take a vote, he is listed as abstaining from voting, but he is listed as being among those present. And why did Bentham want to do this? Well, one, I think he wanted to perhaps poke fun at some of the superstitious notions that a lot of people have. But also, he was a pretty eccentric character. As I'm recording this, there is some research that's being done on Bentham's head to see if he might have suffered from some form of autism, that if he might have been somewhere on the autistic spectrum. But in any case, that gives us an introduction to Bentham. So here is his ethical theory. Well, one of the first things to understand is that in Bentham's lifetime, the gap between the rich and the poor was enormous. I mean, simply put, during this time, if you were born poor, you were going to die poor, and there was not a whole lot that you could do about it. So what Bentham wanted to do was he wanted to create a worldview where everyone could be potentially happy. Both the rich person and the poor person alike, but I would say probably more individuals on the poorer economic side, because oftentimes having lots of money can make a person happy, where, on the poor economic side, sometimes when you don't have as much, income, it can make you very frustrated. Well, what Bentham created is what is called utilitarianism, or usefulness, the word utility deriving from usefulness. But the basic idea is that you seek the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. So that's the basic idea behind utilitarianism, is that, you seek the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people, but we will look at further how, Bentham set this up, how it works. But another point to make is that the happiness or the goodness will vary from each individual. Let me have a quick sip of water and I will focus on this point. In the previous edition of the textbook, the author gives a scenario of a couple wanting to go out and eat French cuisine and then go home and watch Masterpiece Theater, versus a girl selling flowers down on the square so she can make enough money to go to the liquor store, get a bottle of gin, and then go home and get drunk on that bottle of gin. In of itself, either scenario is fine with Bentham's method, so long as the greatest amount of good is being achieved for the greatest number. Now, one individual who comes along later has trouble with that scenario, but that'll be something to address at a later time. So, kind of looking at how Bentham's method works, we have pleasures, pains, the greatest amount of good, and the hedonistic calculus. Hedonism being a Greek word that means pleasure. So read here a little bit from the primary source out of the textbook, An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pleasure and pain. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong. On the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off their subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. In words, a man may pretend to abjure their empire, but in reality he will remain subject to it all the while. The principle of utility recognizes this subjection and assumes it for the foundation of that system, the object of which is to rear the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and of law. I should say tear, not rear. There's a mistake there in the text. So here is a portion of the primary source, An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation from Bentham. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong. On the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off their subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. In words, a man may pretend to abjure their empire, but in reality he will remain subject to it all the while. The principle of utility recognizes this subjection and assumes it for the foundation of that system, the object of which is to tear, as rear there, but should be tear, the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and of law. Systems which attempt to question it deal in sounds instead of sense, in caprice instead of reason, in darkness instead of light. And also, this is not found in the primary source material of our textbook, but it is part of the Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. Pleasures, then, and the avoidance of pains are the ends which the legislator has in view. It behooves him, therefore, to understand their value. Pleasures and pains are the instruments he has to work with. It behooves him, therefore, to understand their force, which is, again, in other words, their value. To a person considered by himself, the value of a pleasure or pain considered by itself will be greater or less according to the four following circumstances: its intensity, its duration, its certainty or uncertainty, its propinquity or remoteness. These are the circumstances which are to be considered in estimating a pleasure or a pain, considered each of them by itself. But when the value of any pleasure or pain is considered for the purpose of estimating the tendency of any act by which it is produced, there are two other circumstances to be taken into account. These are its fecundity, or the chance it has of being followed by sensations of the same kind, that is, pleasures if it be a pleasure, pains if it be a pain. Its purity, or the chance it has of not being followed by sensations of the opposite kind, that is, pains if it be a pleasure, pleasures if it be a pain. These two last, however, are in strictness scarcely to be deemed properties of the pleasures or the pain itself. They are not therefore in strictness to be taken into the account of the value of that pleasure or that pain. They are in strictness to be deemed properties only of the act or other event by which such pleasure or pain has been produced, and accordingly are only to be taken into the account of the tendency of such an act or such an event. To a number of persons, with reference to each of whom the value of a pleasure or pain is considered, it will be greater or less according to seven circumstances, to wit the six preceding ones mentioned earlier, and one other to wit, its extent, that is, the number of persons to whom it extends, or, in other words, who are affected by it. So, basically, here's the idea from Bentham. We are subjected to pleasure and pain. To say that we are not, only we have to do a small amount of demonstration and find out that we are. And that we seek pleasure and we avoid pain at all cost. So essentially, when it comes to making an action, if that action shows more on the pleasurable side, it's an action that should be undertaken. Or if that action shows more on the painful side, it's an action that should not be undertaken. And Bentham, of course, looks at the intensity and the duration and whatnot, and, seeking the greatest amount of good for the greatest number. But that's basically his idea. That we are subjected to pleasure and pain. To say that we're not will only demonstrate and confirm that we are. And so we need to seek the greatest amount of good for the greatest number. We need to seek pleasure and avoid pain at all costs. And so long as the greatest amount of good is being produced, well, that's, what matters. It's not a difficult philosophy to grasp. It's just getting it to work properly that is often the problem. So, is everyone on board with Jeremy Bentham? Well, based on what I just said a moment ago, you can probably guess that the answer is no, and I happened to mention previously that even one particular individual who, is in the utilitarian bracket, he found trouble with a lot of what Bentham, argued for and tried to fix what he thought were the flaws in Bentham's method. But in any case, we're going to stop here, and then when we come back, we will look at the criticisms of Bentham and utilitarianism in general, and, we'll be joined by my introduction to philosophy students on that particular lecture. So, take care. I will symbolically see you then.